Hey Cam,
Hey, Ollie.
thank you so much for doing the podcast with me today. This is my first ever podcast, so I hope it goes well.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
Yes, so let's just go ahead and start with your background a little.
Cool. Yeah. So a little bit about me. Right now, I currently work out of DC for Doordash. I'm a remote employee, but I come out to SF frequently. I work with the consumer team on Android particularly. I've been an Android engineer for 5 or 6 years now. Got into it right whenever everything was worked out finally,
Nice.
and everything's perfect. No, not really. Things are still crazy. But before that, before working at Doordash, I worked at a company called Mapbox for about 3 or 4 years. And I was an Android engineer, but I focused on actually building other tools for other developers to implement inside their app versus actually building an app. So the code that I wrote and the things that we built basically are in many apps and on a lot of devices, which was really a fun project. And Yeah, I had a lot of good memories from that. But
Nice.
at the end of like the third or fourth year, I really noticed that I just wanted to kind of learn the whole app, like focus on a single app. So
Sure.
yeah, so and then before that, I was actually in college studying computer engineering, and was actually anticipating going into more of the hardware sector. That's always fascinated me.
So how did you
Um,
get from there to computer science?
yeah, so I got into it my senior year. We had a group project. It was actually a whole year long that we did this project. And there was about 4 or 5 group members. And for some reason, the day that we picked projects, my team decided to not pick something that we studied in school, but to actually just come up with an idea of building an app. And this app particularly was to assist the disabled, like especially visibly impaired people, to navigate from like classrooms and stuff like that on the university.
So did you
That
have any experience before
Yeah,
that,
so that
or?
was the thing is
Uh,
that prior to this, there was no mobile engineering practice or classes that we took. So I was really new to that element. I did obviously know how to code, but as far as like Java and
mhm.
Swift or any of that, any of the mobile languages, I had no idea what I
Sure.
was going into. So
So, but how did you decide that you're going to be an Android developer, and like, what
so
made you think that that's what you want to
the
do?
crazy fork in the road moment for me was whenever I asked my professor to like get funding for buying the iOS developer license that you have to pay, I guess, annually. I don't know if it still exists, but at the
Yeah, it
time it
still
was like
exists.
$100 a
Yeah,
year.
it's still $100 a year.
And me being a college student, I didn't have $100 to put up front.
Uh-huh.
And so his immediate response was just be an Android engineer or like develop
Right.
this app for Android. And
You can do it for free.
yeah, yeah, and I didn't even have an Android device, so it was kind of a really new element for me to actually go in and um, understand mobile development, but also not understanding at all Android UI frameworks
Right.
and stuff like that. So,
But so what I'm trying to get at is like you majored in computer engineering and not
mhm,
computer science,
yeah,
right? How did you uh, end up working in a computer science field?
yeah,
And
yeah. I
like,
mean,
and why didn't you just like switch your major when you were in college to like computer science?
well, so there's, I guess, a few different reasons for that. I think one of the biggest ones is that I just got into it like really late in the game. So by the
Mm-hmm.
time I was or one semester away from graduation, that's whenever I found the passion of mobile engineering and developing software. But prior to that, I was just really focused on how computers work. Like, how does this essentially a rock,
Mm-hmm.
like just scraps of metal, kind of work together to actually problem solve and create.
Create billions of dollars of
Right.
industries
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
whatnot.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, um, I mean, I could have done that for my career, obviously, and it wasn't until I realized that like it's kind of actually a difficult thing to get a job, in that field, because it's just a lot more schooling to actually like a lot of people that actually design these circuitries and microprocessors and stuff are actually like like they PhD students and whatnot. And so, it was kind of just a coincidence that something that I hated so much, which was that my group chose to do this Android project.
So
did
the group project, was that enough for you to like get a job, or did you have to do something more than just that?
Yeah. So going back to like what I was telling you about what the app actually did, which was to navigate pretty much anyone from like point A to point B on campus. It was essentially like an indoor map. And because it was an indoor map, I had to like do a lot of research on mapping and to understand like what the right platform was to use. Because obviously like Google Maps, that SDK, it's all proprietary and it's like very difficult to actually customize.
Right.
And so the end result was that I got really heavily invested in this open source project called OpenStreetMap, which led me directly to my first startup company, Mapbox, that I worked for. And so whenever I finished my senior project, I was in parallel talking to Mapbox. And it just kind of happened that right when I graduated, I actually applied and went through the whole process and moved to DC. And
so it just all seemed pretty natural to you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say 75% of it was luck. So I definitely put a lot of hours into learning mobile engineering and development, just to kind of, not because like I wanted money or anything like that. It was just because I would find myself trying
You're just like really passionate about it.
Yeah. So
nice.
I mean, there was I have a lot of memories of like just staying up super late because like I thought something would take me 10 minutes, but then it turns out it was like 2 hours, because I was just like reading articles and going through tutorials to like learn how to create a list or something in the UI, so.
Okay. So speaking of lists, what like topics did you have to cover in order for you to be ready that, all right, I'm able to apply and I can start interviewing? Like, I mean, there are people out there that.
Yeah, I think that as far as what got me like the motivation to actually say, hey, I can actually do this and I can apply for this job, was actually not like 100% mobile engineering. It was the fact that I was also like heavily invested on the OpenStreetMap, which is like open source like data collection of the world mapped out.
Interesting.
And that kind of like, I also got to lean on that experience to kind of say, hey, I can do Android development, but I can also, I am familiar with mapping and whatnot. So whenever it came down to like the interview process and whatnot, that was a key component, was that they liked how much I was passionate about the technology and whatnot. And they took a chance and it worked out. So.
And why did you decide to like move on and join Doordash?
Yeah, so that had to do with a lot of just, I was building these tools for other developers to include inside their app, and I was never actually like publishing things on the App Store and gathering analytics in the same way that you do with an app. And it is a whole different game whenever you're actually building for other, like your customers are developers, so you get a lot of like feedback and issues that they're having, and while that's fun, it's also just kind of like I wanted to be on the other side of that too. So
it got a little boring.
Yeah. So it became like I was doing releases like monthly, and just oftentimes debugging things, which was a useful skill to have, but also I wasn't actually, like I said, on the App Store, And
so you just wanted that experience of like actually building stuff, and then other people like downloading it and actually using it, and I also show off to people.
Like it was kind of like a tease, because you would be talking to developers that worked on apps and whatnot, and they would tell you, they would always, from the outside looking in, it seemed like a lot more fun. And then there's some projects that we had to do for Mapbox, and one of them was building this like sample app. And so I was actually building an app, but then obviously it was like an internal app that we use for dog food. And yeah, it was just that was kind of a tease. And then I realized that I really liked building UI and building an app. So
and what were your like biggest struggles when you were trying to learn Android or just coding in general?
Yeah, how complex everything is. But whenever it's like, it was very verbose, especially at the beginning, because up until a year ago, everything on Android I was writing in Java. And I really didn't understand that just to set up like a blank screen, you had to like consider all the lifecycle events. Lifecycle events weren't really a thing for like microprocessors and stuff like that. It's basically like a lot of the code that I was doing before that was more like sequential stuff, where you had just like a main function and then you would throw stuff in it to run your software in a loop. And whenever I got into Android, it was just like someone can close the window whenever they want, and you need to pause this once you add like components and stuff. And so diving into that and understanding all the life cycles and the framework, the basic fundamentals of the framework of Android was quite a challenge. And also like there's like 5 different ways of doing the same thing. So every tutorial that you look at, you're like, which way is better or not? And using your judgment for that is like, that was really difficult.
So how do you actually use your judgment and figure out what you want to follow?
Whenever I first started off, it was basically just get the damn thing to work, you know? I remember
it's always better to get things working than to like...
And there was a lot of mistakes on, like, my code is still out there, I think, for like this project for my senior year. And I was holding on to instances of like static views and stuff whenever the actual view was destroyed. So it's like not good quality whatsoever. But at the same time, I was just genuinely happy that it worked, that it didn't really matter to me. And that's changed definitely from now, where I actually want the damn thing to work.
And it also helps to have like mentors and people doing code reviews and
whatnot. Yeah. I mean, so whenever, once again, I started off, like, I didn't really have any of that. And I was actually teaching myself a lot of the Android development on my own, just because all my professors, my fellow students and whatnot were all working on like mixing software with the hardware. So like thinking ARMs and MIPS and C and C++ and stuff like that to basically build out logic for basic hardware things, like whatever you can dream up, you know. And so I didn't really have anyone to go to actually like get confirmation that I was doing things correctly besides the internet. And that definitely was useful. And then like as time progressed, I have just built up a lot of knowledge about like finding the correct resources, whether that's through like Google's official Android documentation, which has gotten a lot better. Or
I heard like, that it wasn't as
so going back to like me saying that whenever I was doing one thing, there was like 5 different ways of doing it. They've kind of toned that down and kind of strictly, like, they haven't strictly, but they basically only define things in one, this is the way to go, you know? So that's gotten better, but there's also like so many other resources out there. And I would mix that, like articles and how-to tutorials on the internet, with just using GitHub and looking at people's projects and understanding how they did something. I've always found that useful.
That's one of my favorite things to do too, is just look at other like real life projects. Like one thing I did was look at Wikipedia's iOS public source code and just see like what architecture they would use and like how they would like, you know, lay things out.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I still do that to this day. I look at GitHub all the time.
And, like what company X does, you know, for feature Y or whatever, right?
Exactly. And it's really cool on Android. I don't know if iOS has the same kind of marketplace on GitHub and the open source community, but since Android is so big about that, and you can actually install apps directly on your phone. A lot of apps are open source and you can dig into it, but those same open source projects are on the Play Store. So
for sure. And when you were starting out, did you I'm assuming you started off by learning Java, and then when Kotlin became the thing,
transition to so I mean, so my first language that I learned was actually C++, which was a pain. I am not a big fan of pointers. So I did that, and Java was kind of familiar to me in that sense. And so it wasn't too hard. Like, it was one of those things where like it's really easy to read, but then using the right syntax and stuff was a new challenge for me. So it took some while to like pick that up, but then just like it did with Kotlin, whenever I was learning that, and like what exactly was decompiled into the bytecode before you put it on the device, like the same concerns that you have nowadays, you know. But yeah, I mean, that was a challenge for sure. It was learning Java. So,
and then you had to learn Kotlin.
Yes. Yeah. So that was going back to like another reason why I ended up wanting to move from building SDKs to building an app was that because we were building like the SDKs for other developers to incorporate, you had a lot of constraints on yourself. So like, even though Kotlin was a language that's been around for like 3 or 4 years now, we were actually like not able to use that in our SDK because it adds like so many megabytes to that end product. And
it's a higher level language than Java, right? So
yeah, so Kotlin decompiles into Java. So yeah, so like we would use it on certain cases, but like I never really got to dive into it that much. So then now working at Doordash, like that's exclusively the language that we write. And
is it?
So I mean, so like we're trying to convert our project over, so it's like
it's just like what we do from Objective C to
exactly. Yeah, so it's like it's definitely like not a one day thing, but it's also just like it's weird going back between the two and like being like, oh, I have to put a semicolon in Java versus or like a function versus a method, even like the naming of stuff.
Are you more comfortable with Java or Kotlin now at this point?
I'm more comfortable with Kotlin now. It was a lot easier to pick up just because I did have an understanding of Java, and like I said, it decompiles into Java. So having that knowledge, you kind of understand. Like you pick up on it a lot quicker. So like, for example, like building your data model classes is like one line in Kotlin versus like Java where you have to override methods and stuff like that.
I feel like it's, correct me if I'm wrong, but I just feel like for a lot of people, even though it might not be the smartest thing to do, but it might make more sense to start off by learning something hard like C++ or C, and then learning like a higher level language. But at the same time, it might scare people away from learning how to code. So like, I don't know what the best approach would be, but
you'll definitely consider it. You'll definitely like learn C++ first, get all the information about like memory management was really useful. And like, that's actually one thing that I took away from college. Not only like learning C++, but like learning how hardware works, you know? And understanding like, that comes back to like every day whenever I'm coding, like I'm considering like, should I store this huge ass string in something or not? Like, I don't know, just
knowing what happens behind the hood.
It really does shape your thinking process whenever you're actually building stuff out, which is really useful.
Like I think one of the things that a lot of like people, especially the people that are self-taught or are bootcamp grads, struggle with is just understanding what's happening behind the hood, and they end up like writing really like crappy code, and it just really sucks. And it would have been so much different if they had gone through and actually learned like C or C++ or any of these like lower languages.
Well, and then it's also like you just want the thing to work, and then you focus so much time at the very beginning doing that, and then later on working towards reducing your code. So now it's significantly less, and like I said, Kotlin is just not as verbose as Java is, which is nice to have,
As far as career is concerned, do you think it's still a good time to enter this field, or is it too saturated already?
I think it's great. I don't think it's saturated. I think that there's going to be jobs in this field for as long as I'm alive, at least.
Hopefully.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's just computers are everywhere now, and it's only going to get bigger and bigger. I think that one thing that is a consideration that people should have is that it's not like one of those careers where you go to school, you learn something, and then you just apply it for the rest of your career. It's actually something that every day you're going to have to be like learning about and keeping up with like the new things that are out.
Right.
Like Kotlin, for example, like
Yeah,
Java's
you might
kind of
get
like
some other language later
Java's
on.
definitely, it's not a dying language, but it's also like we definitely hire like people that understand Kotlin now. It's just kind of like a requirement.
Okay, so going back to that, is it important for an Android developer to know Java as well as Kotlin, or can they just go by with just
Yeah,
knowing
so this
one
this
or
question
the other?
comes up. I see it a lot on Reddit, actually. There's like an Android dev subreddit, and it feels like every week I see this question from like people that are trying to get into mobile development of whether they should learn Java or Kotlin first. And up until Google I/O this year, Kotlin was kind of like the second language that they were supporting, and now it's like the main language. And I think that's the choice that you should make. I think it's a nice to have to understand Java, but and definitely like you'll pick up concepts from. It'll be easier once you like know one. Like if you know Kotlin, then you'll understand Java like by looking at it. Obviously, like writing the syntax will be different, but
So your answer is both.
yeah, it's really hard to answer that question. Yeah.
Fair enough. It's very similar to like discussions around iOS as well. Like,
Yeah.
people always ask like, should I learn Swift or should I learn
Right.
Objective C or should I learn both? And it's like, well, you just have to learn both because that's really how,
I mean,
how it is.
you're really not going to be able to avoid Java, but at the same time, I wish I could say just Kotlin
Right.
exclusively.
And so, going back to the career discussion, what if like, is there a possibility that native development will take over, non-native
Yeah, like
development, like React?
native
Will that ever take over native development altogether and like put you out of business?
I mean, I did, like, obviously getting into the field, I was considering that because I was just confused, like, why would companies intentionally hire iOS and Android developers? It just seems like a waste of money. But I think React and all these other frameworks do have a place, but it's also kind of just building on top of the technology that we work on. So I don't know exactly how those work, but like I assume that they decompile into Java or something and then kind of run natively on the device that it's compiled for. But I don't think that that's like going to be any. Everyone's trying to solve that problem, you know.
Yeah.
Even Kotlin is kind of trying to be that you can learn Kotlin and use it all over the place, which in some cases, yes, but then others, like, I don't think iOS developers are going to be picking up Kotlin anytime soon. So
Yeah, like I remember when all of this non-native stuff came out a few years ago, like they made it seem like they're going to take over the entire world. But why do you think like we still have a huge need for native development?
I think like what we've been working on at Doordash, I think that whenever it comes to like simple, redundant things that you want to match across all three platforms, being web, iOS, and Android, it becomes useful because you can have one engineer working on it versus three, and accomplish the same thing. But then there's other obvious things like games and stuff like that aren't ever going to work through React Native, or even maps and stuff like that are just like too coupled to being lower level, that putting it at a higher level at like the React and writing all your APIs through that is just too much on the computer to handle, and the performance will just be
technically speaking,
good.
can you like create an app like DoorDash like in React Native 100%?
I wouldn't say right now would be a good time. I don't know if it's
Uh-huh.
in the future like a possibility. I think that the scalability is a key thing, but also like we mentioned, there's so many different frameworks out there, and it seems like
Yeah.
it's changing so frequently that
Right.
you'll build the first iteration of your app in React, and then like a year later, all your APIs will change or something.
Right.
And I don't know, iOS and Android just seem a little more constrained with the native languages that they have, where like you can't just go and change these APIs all the
Sure.
time. So
And like, what's your typical day in life at DoorDash? I know you said you work remotely. So
yeah,
how's
yeah.
that
Remote's a
turning out?
challenge for sure. So this is my first job that I've worked remote. Before
100%
that,
remote or just partially remote?
100% remote. I mean, so
Nice.
I do travel a lot to the San Francisco office, but yeah, I mean, my typical 9 to 5 is working from home.
How's that must be fun. Like you can just work from your
Yeah.
boxers.
So the funny thing about it is that my previous job, Mapbox, like we had so many people that actually did work remote, and I was in the office, and so everything was kind of just geared towards working remote. So all the conversations that happened in the office were actually taking place over Slack, and obviously like all of our meetings and stuff were over video. Whenever I came to DoorDash, I was just under the assumption that every startup functioned the same way, but DoorDash and like many other companies do not have the same policies. They actually want you to be in the office for good reasons. But it also makes it a challenge for working remote, because you're just
Right.
like, I'm missing out on the conversations that happen in the office. So,
Right.
so that's definitely a challenge, and obviously time management as well. But it's more of just like an adjustment than anything
Sure.
else. And once you kind of get into your rhythm and understand the internals of how the company that you're working for works, then
Sure.
things just kind of click. And
How's your day in life like working here?
yeah, so there's a mixture of things that I have to do. I mean, so there's obviously like way more time spent on operations than I'd like. So operations being like email and logistics for like booking travel and stuff like that, that are just time consuming. Meetings even, which are not too much fun. But then obviously a lot of the time is spent developing and building out Android features and stuff like that for our app. So there's kind of that mixture.
So
So
what part of our app do you work on?
yeah, so I work on the consumer app,
So
particularly
for
more
people that don't know,
specifically.
can you be like can you
Yeah,
use-
so the consumer app is so DoorDash has 3 apps. They have on Android at least. They have the Dasher app, which is the delivery. Like if this was Lyft, I guess this is a good analogy.
Sure.
Is like if this was Lyft, the Dasher app would be kind of the driver app, and the consumer app is who you're picking up or whatnot. So so I particularly focus on the consumer app, and even more specifically work on like once the user has already checked out and they're kind of just waiting on their order to show up. I focus on kind of making that experience the best it can be. So
Can you provide like a specific example of like what you worked on?
yeah, so what I've worked on so far has been mostly like whenever things go bad. So if for some reason an order is running late, or it never arrived, or like an item is missing, or you got tomatoes on your sandwich whenever you didn't want that, then there's all these kind of like workflows that kind of help resolve that issue. And when I first joined DoorDash, it was like very manual process where like if anything went wrong, you would have to chat with someone, like a real human being, to resolve the issue, which
And it gets very expensive for the company.
it's
right?
very expensive. And it's
Yeah.
also on the consumer front, it's just like annoying. Like
Yeah.
it should be a lot quicker and easier, especially since it's a mobile app. Like,
Right.
and so, yeah, so most of my time has been spent kind of identifying those issues and those bottlenecks, and what are the common issues that people have, and then looking into how we can automate them so that the user can actually resolve the issue without ever talking to a person, and cut down on both the DoorDash cost for actually supporting that system, and then also increasing the customer satisfaction in that front. But
you're automating things.
yeah, not too much, but and then hopefully this next quarter we'll be focusing on more of how do we resolve that issue, like how do we solve not having the user have to deal with that, in the first place. So whether that's like giving more information or improving the map or
sure.
all
So
that kind of stuff.
I know a lot of people are wondering like how the development process looks like at a tech company like DoorDash.
Mm-hmm.
So can you just walk me through like everything from how you decide that this new feature needs to be implemented all the way until it gets shipped to the App Store or whatever?
So there's a lot more overhead than I thought whenever it comes to like mobile development in general on the app front, and that overhead being like we want to make sure that the code that you're producing and the feature that you're adding is actually of the quality that we expect. So to give an example, like DoorDash consumer Android, we have about 10 engineers that are available to like review the code base or what you're trying to introduce in the code. But then you have like I have a personal project that I just merge directly into mastery, like there's no like hard, like I could do the same, I can release a feature in one day, versus DoorDash, which obviously takes a little bit longer because you're relying on other people to review the code and look at it and test it and make sure that the quality is there that they expect. Right. So on that front, it does take a little bit longer to get features into the app.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I think like as far as the development process for a feature, there's also like different stages that I think we go through of like identifying the right way of going about engineering this, because it really is engineering. You're trying to like think of like, for example, like whenever we want to show a route on a map, or like add an ETA to the order status page, like there's once again like 5 different ways of doing that. And then also you're dealing with like a lot of legacy code typically, which is challenging. And so first, whenever I'm assigned like a feature or like adding a new feature to the app, I just like kind of have to take a step back and like look at where are the best places to actually introduce this thing, or like, do I really want to go in and refactor all of this to make this happen, or should I just like throw it in there and like patch it?
Who do you have these discussions with usually?
Mostly with the team. I would say about 75% of it though is just like looking at the code myself and looking at and I think that's a little bit easier now just because of the experience that
you just give out like an estimation and you just communicate the estimation.
Right. Yeah. So we have like daily
options.
stand-ups. We have meetings and stuff that we sync up on, which are critical in so many ways, just to understand where other people are going to be working on in the code base, and the expectations that we have. We'll have conversations that just strictly revolve around how we want the app to be architected. And so for the most part, we try to follow all the same patterns so that if I had to go and jump in on another section of the app, I would still understand what...
By pattern, you mean like the architectural pattern, like MVC, MVVM?
Yeah, exactly. Like So we use MVVM, but that being said, there's also a mixture of MVP because the architecture has evolved so much.
What's your favorite architectural pattern?
So MVVM is kind of this bittersweet architecture pattern where it kind of helps you handle the garbage collector on Android and to handle like persistent state on a device. And so in that front and that using that, it's lovely, but then also it's just kind of like no one else really uses MVVM, and it is kind of like a glorified MVP pattern if you look at it that way. So, but yeah, I don't really have a favorite.
Do you also have like this problem of like bloated view controllers like we have in iOS?
Whenever I look at so with MVP, that was kind of the case, was like you're supposed to put all your logic in presenter, but then if you are, this is still the case, I guess now, but like depending on how lazy you are, you'll just throw all this stuff in the view versus extracting it as much of the logic as possible away from the view so that you can actually test directly through the JVM. So you don't have to wait 2 minutes for compile time to run the app and then write these UI tests that actually go in and execute clicks on views and test it that way. You can actually just like run logical JUnit test. So,
nice. Are you using
really
like any third-party framework for testing, or are just standard?
There's a lot on Android, which is I was really surprised. I don't think iOS has that much.
Yeah, we primarily use Quick and Nimble.
I think a big part of that is obviously because whenever it comes to unit testing, it's just strictly Java. So Java's been around for a lot longer, it seems like, than Objective-C, and has had so many other use cases. So yeah, there's like an uncountable number of testing frameworks out there. So, but I mean,
what's your favorite framework for testing?
So I really like, I actually like writing UI tests. We don't do enough of them, and like you don't want to do as many of them because they're very fragile. But I think it's really fun to write them and to have them running and testing, and I think it's really useful. But that being said, like obviously unit tests and writing using JUnit is probably the most useful framework, or the one that I use the most. But then there's like Mockito, there's Robo Electric, which is kind of like it helps you bridge the gap of pure Java and Android. So
so we talked a lot about your what you do in your job and everything else, but I want to just transition to like talking about preparing for the job interview as for an Android developer. Besides Android development topics, are there any other CS topics that they should be like learning?
Yeah, I guess I can kind of talk about my experience trying to transition between just Mapbox and Doordash. So whenever I decided to kind of move on from Mapbox, I didn't really know what I wanted to end up. I just knew I wanted to be on an Android app and somewhat on logistics, just because that was what I was familiar with. And so it was really just a numbers game. Like I applied to a lot of different jobs, and did you
ever get rejected from any companies?
Yes, many. Yeah. There was ones that I would show up for the interview and completely like flunk the interview because it was hinged on one question or something, and everything was built off of that, and I couldn't answer the right question. And depending on who you are, like if you're able to kind of go in and actually have a mindset of I'm gonna study for this interview, I'm gonna go and like just work through all these different problems on the internet that like these practice courses have. That's awesome. That's really good. But I was not one of those people. And I I'm just more driven by the passion of building Android and seeing the end result. Sure. And so when it came to most of my job, I would say like 50-50 of the jobs were like very technical, and they would ask you one question and you have to go through and like live program, like a whiteboard interview.
Oh, like one of those lead code or
exactly. And then I would say the rest were kind of getting to know me and asking me just like what I've done in the past to resolve this issue and whatnot, which are like, that's my favorite kind of interview, you know, because it's just, that's actually talking about like why I'm so passionate about a library or something like that. And you just get more of a sense of like the everyday, what you're going to be doing if you did get hired versus whiteboard interviews where like you probably aren't going to actually have to write a binary tree, search tree, you know?
But they still ask that. I don't know why a lot of these companies ask like these questions.
I would say that a lot of it is not expecting you to actually complete the answer like perfectly written with the correct syntax. And in fact, like a lot of these job interviews do the opposite, where they actually go in and say, they'll give you the problem, but then they'll say, you don't have to actually use the right syntax as long as I can understand what you're doing. And that's because they just want to kind of see you think and solve the issue by like working with the actual person that's giving the interview to come up with an end result. And so yeah, typically you'll go into those interviews and there's no way you're going to answer the question perfectly.
Right.
But once you have the understanding that they're just like kind of testing you on those different, like your communication skills and
Sure.
problem solving and not getting frustrated, then that's whenever those interviews tend to go really good.
What do you do when you get stuck? Like, say they ask you a technical question and you're like, you have no idea how to
so
approach it.
the best thing to do, what I've personally found is useful, is to kind of just don't shut up. Just ask a ton of questions until they kind of cave in and then kind of give you a hint or something to steer you in the right direction. And I mean, I've definitely had interviews where even if that was the case where they were giving me hints, I couldn't even get past the next step, you know? And
it's okay, right? You just need one
yeah, well,
interview.
at that point too, you're just kind of not, I don't know, I was kind of more not interested in that because like, is this going to be my life every day? Are you going to be asking me this?
Yeah.
So I think that just finding the right fit for you through that interview process is just as critical as the company trying to find out if you're a good fit.
Yeah. I'm curious to know, like, what's your worst interview experience?
Yeah. So it was actually the interview that I had the day after I interviewed with Doordash.
Okay.
So Doordash had a great process for the interview where it was mostly like of asking questions and understanding your passion
for domain specific questions rather than like generic.
Just like how would you architect this thing versus like
reverse linguist.
yes. Yeah. So the day after though, I went and interviewed for this one company that did the exact opposite and asked me like this one question, which was I think it was like a binary search tree, like and so we had a whiteboard probably like by a 10-foot by 10-foot board, you know, and like the entire thing was just like filled up by the end of the couple hours that we were in this interview for. But it was not my handwriting at all. It was mostly this guy's, you know.
That sounds horrible.
And it was bad, and just culturally, like just meeting these people and stuff, it became very clear that I wasn't the right fit at all for what they were looking for. And also it did help that the day before I was at this interview and was just felt like that was I nailed it, you know.
Have you ever felt that you're not good enough when you actually start working? Like, what is that word called? When people feel like they're not good enough and they're not that
like confidence?
Not confidence. There's a special word. They feel like they're intruding.
I understand where you're going.
There's that word. Yeah. Oh my God. It's like in the tip of my tongue. But anyways, like
now I'm doing it too.
But like the idea, where
like stepping on people's toes.
Well, they come in and they're like, they feel like they're not.
You feel like you're a burden.
You feel like you're a burden. You feel like you don't belong there. Right. You just feel terrible. You feel like you're not good enough, and they accidentally just accepted you. Like
I mean, I feel that way all the time whenever I am working. Like that feeling doesn't really go away. I mean, working remotely it's really hard on a day-to-day level of like, did I contribute enough to feel good about for them paying me, you know?
Right.
And that's just something I think that some people have and some people are able to get past that. But like that factor's always in. I think that you'll have the realization that everyone kind of has that as well. And you have good days and you have bad days as well. And obviously, like, if they hired you and you're there, you're contributing ideas and stuff, and no matter what, it's going to be beneficial, you know. And you go into like a new job and you're just like, oh, this is just me against everyone else, you know, to kind of show that I can produce stuff. But that's actually not the case. It's that people are there to help you succeed and benefit from the company. So
Right. And like to your point, I just feel like if you realize that almost everyone else feels the same way, it kind of helps you a lot. I haven't met a single person that doesn't feel, God, I'm trying to remember that word, but doesn't feel that, right?
Right.
I'll put it in the video so people can look at it. But just like understanding that you're not the only person that feels like that, and everyone else, even the manager, right? Like there are cases where many managers don't even feel like they're
well, and then also what makes a good manager is that they probably know it before you even do. So they know that things aren't going good or something, so they'll tend to reach out to you before things get really sour, you know.
And that's one of the things I really like about Doordash is that we have these one-on-ones with our manager. We both have the same manager.
Absolutely,
and like, you know, Andrethan is just so amazing at just like pointing out.
For sure, and like there's definitely frustrations that come through as far as like resistance to actually get something published in the app, or just like your own lack of knowledge on something, a topic or something. And it's kind of just knowing that you're good at, like, that's kind of a weakness of yourself, and then there's obviously like things that you are probably better at than other people, and so just applying those things and those skills to your everyday work will help kind of balance things.
So like before we wrap up, I just have one more question. I got this question a lot from people, which is, how do you always stay in demand? Just pretend for a moment that Android development will no longer be the thing in 5 years. Like, how do you constantly keep yourself on your toes and stay in demand? Like,
So this comes down to like just constantly learning new languages and keeping up on the technology as it changes. One thing that I really like about Java and Kotlin particularly is that it's actually not constrained to Android. Like, there's actually a lot of use cases for having knowing those languages. One of the most heavily used is writing backend using Java or something, and obviously like Android development is my number one and stuff, but also too, like, I can go in and like just learn the frameworks of backend development and hopefully migrate to that if I had to. But yeah, I think the answer is just like constantly be learning. And there's a lot of time wasted learning stuff too, because like you'll think that you're like spending the time learning the thing that you should be, but then really
what do you mean by that? Can you be more specific?
So there's times where like I am looking to add a drop shadow for a button maybe or something, and just dive in so much to like documents and tutorials on that, whenever in reality that makes no difference. That's just like one example, but there's so many times where like I've like picked up language, or like started to be interested in languages and like looked into it and researched it, and then they've fallen completely, or like I just never used that skill, you know. And so like it went went in one ear and out the other, you know.
Out the other.
So,
but I mean, in a way, it's nice because if you ever have to learn that, it's not a completely new thing.
Right. Yeah. So JavaScript is kind of that to me, because I have had times where I've like had to write some like websites and stuff like that using that, and it's kind of one of those things where like I learn it and I get kind of fluent with it and can consistently write some code, and then after like 3 weeks it's kind of just out, and I completely forgot it, and I have to learn everything over again.
I think it also helps like when people instead of just like reading or watching videos, if they actually like practice whatever they're learning, actually code whatever it is that they're following along, that really helps.
I think it depends on the person, how they like are just naturally good at learning, whether that's a visual or like just reading and studying. Me personally, like college was kind of tough in that sense, because you would go in and like learn these topics from professors and then have to write or like do testing on it. When actually the area that I was good at was the associated labs that we had. So whether that was like physics or computer engineering, like digital classes and stuff like that, or circuitry, it tended to be like that. For me, it was always the labs that I would be like really crushing it and be passionate about it, and then the classes, and that still holds true now. Like I think that if you're if you're self-learning mobile and development, I don't think I would be as much interested in it if someone else was teaching me. It was like one of those things like I just had to learn on my own and come up with like a silly idea to like actually build something and go out and do it, whether that's like a to-do list app or something like that to get you
Speaking
started.
of silly ideas, do you have any apps on the Play Store?
I do have the one from senior year.
Nice.
I don't know what's happened to it at all. It's probably out there still.
Okay.
And then there's actually one that I have been working on. It's not actually on the App Store yet, but I've been doing it. It's kind of like a project that I've just been using to kind of hone my skills. And it was actually one that I used to really pick up Kotlin whenever I was primarily on Java. And so the app is basically like, the idea is that it would kind of, it's all like obviously a map because that's what I know. And it has a bunch of markers and you can like add an event to it. And as like the event approaches, like the marker gets bigger, and then it basically tells you like if there's a festival or something that's going on around you, that you can go to this, like what's going on around you essentially is like the question or like the answer that I'm trying to provide with the app. And so, yeah, but more than it, like I don't really care about users or anything at that point. Like it's just like a fun project that I can get away with merging code directly into master, you know?
Right. And that you can talk about with your future interview.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I used that project actually in one of my interviews for Doordash. So
nice. What's funny is that a lot of these projects that sometimes like you feel like they're not good enough or they're not that important.
Right.
But the interview doesn't really care. Like as long as you have something to talk about, like that's what
it's really just keeping the conversation going. So
exactly.
Like I wish all interviews were like that. But the good ones for me tend to be whenever there's a good conversation going about like architecture or something, you know?
Right.
It's a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, Cam, thank you so much for doing this podcast
it's been great.
with me. And have a wonderful day.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much.